Hi, I'm Mike from 30-Second Photo Tips, but today's tip is going to be a little bit longer because we're tackling the exposure triangle. If you're not familiar with what the exposure triangle is, it's an easy way to remember that there are three elements that affect your exposure: your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. The problem is that there are so many illustrations and explanations of the exposure triangle online that it can get very confusing. Some are simple. Some have values along each side. Some point the triangle's vertexes to the values. Some have triangles within triangles. Some have crisscrossing grids of internal triangles. Not only are all of these confusing, but they're often inconsistent and misleading. And let's be honest, who wants to be thinking about geometry when you're trying to set your exposure? I spent some time going through different iterations of the exposure triangle, and there's one way that I think it could possibly make sense. You set the aperture and shutter speed so they're ascending either side of the triangle, with allowing more light at the top, and then set the ISO at the bottom with the lower ISO on the left and the higher ISO on the right. Now, say that your theoretical correct exposure is 1/250th at 5.6 and ISO 800, and you want to change your shutter speed to 1/125th. Then you would need to adjust either your aperture to f8 or your ISO to 400. So you move things either clockwise or counterclockwise based on whatever the correct exposure needs to be. While this makes sense, my issue is that you only need to adjust one setting at a time, so using a triangle doesn't really provide any benefit, and it can be confusing if someone is just learning. And if your triangle isn't set up exactly like this, or the opposite of this, I guess, then it won't work. Plus, you also need to remember which direction things need to go. A better alternative, I think, is to use the exposure triangle as a mnemonic device to remember that there are three things to control exposure. That's it. Then you can think of adjusting your exposure more linearly by just lining up the settings and using your camera's built-in meter. If your base exposure is 1/250th at f5.6 and ISO 800, and you move the shutter speed to 1/125th, you can either move the aperture to f8 or the ISO to 400 to get a balanced exposure. If you keep moving your ISO to 200, you can see that your meter will show the image being underexposed. So let's reset our theoretical base exposure. If you're just getting started out with photography and trying to learn how to control exposure, I'd recommend setting your ISO at a fixed setting like 800 and only use the shutter speed and aperture to change your exposure. It's important to make sure that you don't have your camera set to auto ISO, because that will end up changing your ISO and making things even more confusing. So just to summarize, use the exposure triangle as a mnemonic device to remember that shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are the three main settings that affect your exposure. But learn how each of them work with the meter in your camera to help you get the correct exposure. If you found this to be helpful, please follow or subscribe, and let me know if you have any questions or feedback in the comments.